Hey guys, tonight we step straight into the misty heart of Victorian London. The lamps along the Strand sputter faint halos of yellow, and your shoes clack against wet cobblestones. You pull your collar tight, partly against the chill and partly against the peculiar stillness that comes only at midnight in a restless city. The fog is thick enough to taste, coal smoke tangled with damp river air, and the faint aroma of roasted chestnuts from a vendor who simply refuses to close. You're not here for chestnuts, though. You're here because you cannot sleep. Welcome to the nightly wanderings of a Victorian insomniac. And spoiler alert, you probably wouldn't survive this without collapsing from sheer exhaustion long before dawn. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love it if you dropped a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always fun to see the mix of night owls and early birds in this little community. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You tug your coat tighter, following the trail of lamplight toward the Thames. Sleep is a stubborn stranger, refusing to meet your gaze. And you're not alone. Victorians love to write about sleeplessness, almost as if it were its own character haunting their streets. Doctors called it a malady of modern life, a byproduct of gas lamps and new machines that made the city hum even after midnight. Historians still argue whether it was truly worse than before, or whether people simply began noticing it more once doctors gave it a fashionable name: insomnia. The city provides plenty of distractions. The watchman yawns at his corner post, wishing his shift would end. A carriage rattles by, horse hooves clicking in rhythm like some perverse lullaby. Can you imagine how many other restless souls peer from curtained windows, staring at nothing, rehearsing tomorrow's worries? That sense of being awake while the world sleeps, it feels new to Victorians, though of course it isn't. The Romans had their nocturnal warriors, and medieval monks practically scheduled their insomnia into prayer vigils. But in the age of Queen Victoria, sleeplessness carried a special sting. It felt tied to progress itself. Some writers blamed the railways. Imagine the constant timetables, whistles piercing the night, and the sense that somewhere out there a train is always running. Others pointed to industrial noise, the factories clanging away even after sundown. Still others muttered about diet. Tea too strong, coffee too plentiful, sugar sneaking into every pastry. You sip your imaginary cup of evening cocoa and think, maybe they had a point. One mainstream fact you can't avoid: medical journals of the 19th century started listing insomnia as a standalone condition, not just a symptom of nerves or melancholy. That was new. Before, sleeplessness was more like a background annoyance, not a diagnosis. Now it had clout. That meant doctors could prescribe, manufacturers could sell, and insomniacs could wear the label proudly. Well, proudly in the way you'd tell your neighbor, "I'm not lazy, I'm an invalid." A quirkier tidbit waits on the next street corner. There, under the lamplight, a man in a stovepipe hat whispers about a new miracle syrup. He swears it's made with lettuce essence, because lettuce has natural sleep powers. This isn't a joke. Lettuce soup and lettuce tonics were genuine Victorian remedies. You picture some poor fellow sipping warm lettuce tea at 2 in the morning, trying not to crunch too loudly on the leaves. Hardly glamorous, but at least it's cheaper than laudanum. You wander further, into the poorer districts where cramped lodging houses are stacked with weary bodies. Here insomnia takes a different shape. It's not the dainty ailment of aristocrats with velvet drapes and imported mattresses. It's the result of overcrowding, snoring neighbors, thin walls, and the constant itch of coal dust. Imagine lying awake while 50 other people breathe around you. No miracle pill will fix that. Yet the Victorians insisted on treating sleeplessness as a problem of the individual, not the environment. It was always your nerves, your habits, your digestion. If you couldn't sleep, you were either overthinking or underpraying. That was the paradox. Society buzzed louder than ever, yet solutions kept pointing back at personal failure. Doesn't that sound familiar? Scroll a wellness blog today, and you'll find echoes of the same blame game. The streets grow quieter as the night stretches on. You hear only the gentle lap of the Thames and the rattle of a distant carriage. You feel both comforted and mocked. Comforted by the stillness, mocked by the knowledge that morning will come soon and you'll still be awake. Some insomniacs in this era wrote about the haunting beauty of nighttime walks, claiming they felt more alive when the city dozed. Others dreaded each passing hour, fearing what sleeplessness might do to their health. And yes, Victorians really did worry that lack of sleep could lead to madness. Physicians wrote entire essays about the link between insomnia and lunacy. Historians still argue whether these fears reflected genuine medical observations or just moral panics about overstimulated minds. Either way, insomnia carried a whiff of danger, a suggestion that staying awake too long might unravel the very fabric of your sanity. You glance up at the looming clock tower of St. Paul's, its face glowing faintly in the fog. 2 o'clock and you're wide awake. The temptation is strong to duck into an apothecary, to reach for one of those little bottles lined up on the shelves, syrups, powders, and draughts promising dreamless oblivion. But tonight you resist. Tonight you simply walk, letting the fog seep into your coat and the rhythm of your footsteps soothe your restless mind. Sleep, if it comes, will find you wandering. You push open the creaky door of a Victorian apothecary, and suddenly, the city's fog is replaced by a powdery sweetness, camphor, lavender oil, and that unmistakable whiff of sugar syrup. Shelves stretch to the ceiling, lined with bottles in every hue, amber, cobalt, emerald, each promising something miraculous. Tonight you're hunting for the cure that every sleepless Victorian seemed to crave. Patent pills dressed up in candy colors. Patent medicine was the fad of the age, and you feel like a child wandering into a candy shop. Boxes of insomnia lozenges gleam under gaslight, printed with swirls of pink ink, embossed lettering, and cheerful promises like sure rest in 60 minutes or gentle slumber without dreams. They're so decorative you almost forget what they are. Drugs disguised as sweets. The Victorians were masters of marketing, and their pillboxes looked more like Valentine cards than medical supplies. Here's the mainstream fact. By the mid-19th century, Britain had thousands of proprietary remedies circulating. Many advertised specifically as nighttime cures. Some contained quinine. Others, opium, and some, believe it or not, were little more than chalk dust and molasses. Doctors protested, but their protests were drowned out by jingles in penny newspapers. Advertising worked then much as it does now. If you saw enough glowing testimonials, you'd start to believe the cure was a necessity. A fringe tidbit waits behind the counter. The apothecary proudly shows you a box labeled Dr. James's analeptic pills. They're said to cure insomnia, indigestion, and female complaints all in one swallow. The catch? Historians still argue whether they actually contained anything beyond sugar. But hey, at least they made your breath sweet. So if you were still awake at 3 in the morning, you could whisper your misery with minty freshness. You can't help chuckling at the spectacle. One brand even promised relief by coating pills in bright pink sugar. Picture yourself, already jittery from sleeplessness, licking a candy-like tablet that probably adds more sugar to your bloodstream than it removes anxiety. So it's almost poetic. The Victorians soothed their restless nights with the very stimulant that might keep them up longer. That's like solving caffeine jitters by downing an espresso. The apothecary offers you a sample of chloral hydrate syrup, marketed then as the safe modern solution. You swirl the viscous liquid in its little glass and notice the faint almond scent. Victorians genuinely believed it was a scientific breakthrough. And in fairness, it did knock people out cold. The trouble was, people often failed to wake up the same way they drifted off. Doctors wrote polite letters of warning, but advertisements drowned them out with promises of a night as soft as clouds. Historians still argue whether patent cures for insomnia truly spread comfort or simply traded one dependency for another. On one hand, many people swore by them. On the other, the sheer number of overdoses and mysterious nighttime deaths raised eyebrows. That debate continues in scholarly journals, with some suggesting Victorian insomnia pills were as much about placebo comfort as actual pharmacology. You lean against the polished counter, flipping through a pamphlet filled with testimonials. They're written in florid prose. I, a humble vicar plagued by wakeful thoughts, now sleep 8 hours straight thanks to Dr. B's soothing syrup. You raise an eyebrow. 8 hours straight. Even the most committed napper in the modern age would envy that. Somewhere between truth and marketing lies the real story. Insomniacs were desperate, and desperation sells. Beyond the glow of the shop, you imagine weary clerks and seamstresses carrying home their little bottles, carefully stashing them beside the bed. 1 pill tonight, 2 if the street noise is bad, maybe 3 if the mind won't stop spinning. By morning, they'd feel foggy, but at least they'd survived another night without the gnawing dread of staring at the ceiling. There's humor in it, too. Imagine a Victorian couple quarreling about dosage. One insists on just half a pill, the other sneaks 3 with a wink. It's the same argument couples have today about melatonin gummies. Don't take too many, you'll be groggy. But if I don't, I'll never sleep. Some debates really are timeless. The apothecary thanks you kindly and reminds you to store the pills away from children, though in truth, they often marketed the same syrups for both adults and infants. Yes, Victorian mothers gave their babies opium-laced sleeping syrups. A shudder runs down your spine. Quirky tidbit or quiet tragedy? Probably both. Parents needed rest too, and the solution was sold in friendly packaging with cartoon cherubs. If your toddler dozed through the night, the ad declared, your family had the blessing of rest. Modern ears hear danger. Victorian ears heard relief. You pocket your imaginary sample and step back into the night. The fog feels thicker now, but also strangely comforting. You think about the way Victorians wrapped sleeplessness in pretty packaging, transforming a raw human struggle into a commercial opportunity. It's not so different from today's lavender sleep sprays and weighted blankets. At least now fewer of them are secretly opium in disguise, though some modern cures might be just as questionable in the long run. By the time you wander toward your lodging, you realize you've become part of this story. You've walked the aisles, handled the pink pillboxes, and wondered at their promises. And though your eyes are still wide open, there's something soothing in knowing you're not the first to search for rest this way. Insomniacs across centuries have shared this same ritual, reaching for remedies that look charming in daylight and irresistible at 2 in the morning. The night air chills your face as you leave the brass and feather showroom behind. A different glow beckons now, the discreet green glass of an apothecary's window, the kind that whispers promises in Latin labels. You push open the door and there it is, the faint medicinal perfume of alcohol and herbs, but also that unmistakable undertone of something stronger. Tonight you step into the shadowy corner, where Victorians kept their most infamous secret for sleep, opium in the form of laudanum, tucked neatly beside the evening teacup. The mainstream fact is clear. Laudanum was everywhere in the 19th century. A tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol. It was cheap, potent, and legal. Physicians prescribed it for everything from coughs to cramps, and yes, especially for sleeplessness. You imagine yourself in a genteel parlor, clock ticking softly, as the host sets down 2 cups, one of Earl Grey, one of laudanum. "A sip to settle the nerves," they might murmur, as if the difference between tea and narcotic were only a matter of taste. The quirky tidbit? Some Victorians swore by mixing laudanum with port wine, claiming the combination made dreams more delicate. Others dropped a few tincture drops onto a sugar cube, letting it dissolve like candy. Picture yourself as a sleepless soul at midnight, spooning sugar laced with opium into your mouth, like some bizarre precursor to gummy sleep aids. Sweet dreams indeed. Of course, historians still argue whether Victorians truly understood the addictive nature of laudanum. Some claim doctors downplayed the risks because they genuinely believed the dose was safe. Others suggest the booming trade blinded everyone to the dangers. Either way, opium drifted quietly into drawing rooms, nurseries, and nightstands, disguised in elegant bottles with gold lettering. You sit in a velvet armchair, sipping your own imaginary dose. The warmth spreads instantly, heavy and thick, as if blankets have been draped over your thoughts. You picture writers of the era, Coleridge, De Quincey, scribbling feverishly under its influence, some claiming laudanum helped them dream more vividly, others confessing it shredded their nerves. There's an irony here. The very substance prescribed to banish insomnia often produced the wildest, most unsettling dreams. Sleep came, yes, but hardly restful. Across the room, a middle-class matron folds her hands, praising her doctor for recommending laudanum when herbal teas failed. Next to her, a frazzled clerk tips the bottle a little too generously, hoping for oblivion after 12 hours of ledgers. And in the nursery upstairs, a spoonful is given to the baby so the household may sleep through the night. You pause at that image, parents sleeping soundly while the child drifts into unnatural quiet. This was the darker undercurrent of the Victorian cure craze. Still, laudanum carried an air of elegance. The bottles were often labelled with phrases like elixir of peace or nightly tonic. Imagine keeping one on your nightstand, nestled between the Bible and a candlestick. The ritual became as normal as brushing teeth, just a few drops before bed, like modern melatonin gummies, only with a far more sinister undertow. The cultural divide shows itself again. For the wealthy, laudanum was a refined indulgence poured delicately into crystal glasses. For the poor, it was survival in liquid form, a cheap way to silence hunger or exhaustion. It blurred class lines in a way few substances could. Everyone, from poets to factory workers, shared in this chemical lullaby, and yet the stigma lingered. Even as people praised its effects, they whispered about dependence. Was it truly a cure or was it a chain? Historians still argue about whether Victorian society willfully ignored the problem or whether people were too desperate for relief to care. It's hard to judge. If you'd been awake for 5 nights straight in a freezing London tenement, you might not have asked too many questions either. Your eyelids droop as you picture yourself wandering home through fog, a little bottle hidden in your pocket. There's comfort in its weight, in knowing that tonight at least you won't toss endlessly on the mattress. The debate between safety and solace fades, replaced by the simple yearning for silence in your mind. Of course, not all remedies were so heavy-handed. A few steps further down the street, you'll soon find kitchens simmering with nutmeg milk and chamomile tea. But for now you linger in the velvet-draped parlour, laudanum glass at hand, listening to the soft ticking of the clock and wondering if the dreams ahead will be merciful or mischievous. You leave behind the velvet parlour with its crystal glass of laudanum and drift instead toward a warm, flickering kitchen. The smell hits you first, milk scalding gently on the stove, nutmeg dusting the air like spice drifting through a bakery, and honey melting into a thick, golden swirl. This is the humbler side of Victorian insomnia cures, home remedies concocted in kitchens where the budget didn't stretch to fancy pills or gleaming bed frames. The mainstream fact here is straightforward. Victorians widely believed in food as medicine, and for sleeplessness, warm milk was king. Physicians often recommended it as the safest bedtime ritual. You imagine yourself pouring a steaming mug, watching the nutmeg settle like tiny specks of earth, and sipping while candlelight flickers on cracked plates. It wasn't glamorous, but it was comfort in liquid form, and sometimes that was enough. Quirky tidbits abound in these kitchens. One popular recipe called for boiled lettuce water. Yes, lettuce again. That humble salad leaf cropping up like a recurring punchline. Supposedly, a broth made from simmered lettuce leaves was calming to the nerves. Picture yourself slurping pale green soup at midnight, convincing yourself it will coax you into slumber. And if lettuce didn't appeal, Victorians also experimented with vinegar tonics, onion poultices pressed to the chest, or even roasted apples eaten hot before bed. None of these scream scientific breakthrough, but each carried the gentle hope that a full stomach and soothing flavor might lull the mind. Historians still argue whether these folk recipes worked through any real chemical property or whether they were simply rituals, tiny, reassuring acts that signaled to the body it was time to wind down. The modern term is sleep hygiene, but the Victorians would have called it good household sense. You picture a family gathered round a wood-burning stove. The father yawns dramatically to set an example. The mother sprinkles nutmeg with theatrical precision. The children giggle before sipping their warm cups. It's less about chemistry than about rhythm, the household agreeing that the day is done. The laughter fades, and soon even the children are rubbing their eyes. Ritual can be as potent as medicine when it comes to coaxing sleep, but insomnia is a stubborn guest. Imagine yourself drinking the milk, licking the honey from your lips, and still staring at the rafters wide-eyed. What then? Some Victorians swore by midnight walks in the garden, others by placing herbs under the pillow. Rosemary, chamomile, even dill seeds wrapped in cloth sachets. You can almost smell the faint sweetness tucked beneath linen sheets. A sort of homemade aromatherapy, centuries before scented candles filled gift shops. One particularly quirky belief suggested rubbing the soles of your feet with goose fat before bed. Supposedly, the fat drew out restless humors. You shudder at the image of greasy sheets, then chuckle at the absurdity. Still, if you'd been lying awake for days, you might have tried it. Desperation is a powerful motivator, and besides, goose fat was cheaper than a bottle of chloral hydrate. As you sit by the fire, you notice how these kitchen cures weren't just about sleep. They were about comfort. The smell of nutmeg, the hiss of milk bubbling over, the steady hum of a family routine. In a world where the wealthy prescribed narcotics and brass beds, the poor found their solace in humble ingredients. And perhaps they slept just as well, or just as poorly, as their wealthier neighbors. Historians still debate whether these remedies reflected genuine folk wisdom or were simply the only tools available to the working class. Did lettuce water really calm the nerves? Did warm milk truly alter the brain's chemistry? Modern science suggests maybe not, but the point was never about chemistry. The point was about ritual, familiarity, and the simple reassurance of doing something when sleep refused to come. You set down your empty mug and feel the warmth spread through your chest. The kitchen is quiet now. Only the soft pop of the dying fire and the rustle of mice in the walls. Outside the city hums, but in here, the world has shrunk to a circle of warmth and spice. You imagine your eyelids growing heavy, not from laudanum, not from brass contraptions, but from the sheer comfort of ritual repeated night after night. And even if you remain awake, there's still sweetness in this ritual, the taste of nutmeg on your tongue, the smell of honey in the air, and the knowledge that sleeplessness doesn't always need to be fought with a bottle or a pill. Sometimes it can be coaxed gently, with the humble kindness of a midnight kitchen. The kitchen fades behind you, the scent of nutmeg giving way to something heavier, velvet curtains, polished mahogany, and the faint sweetness of imported tobacco. You find yourself ushered into the hushed bedroom of a Victorian aristocrat, where sleeplessness is treated less like a nuisance and more like a performance. The fire crackles in a marble hearth, portraits of stern ancestors gaze down, and somewhere behind the curtains, a physician clears his throat, ready to whisper prescriptions no commoner could afford. The mainstream fact comes first. Elite Victorians had access to a different tier of remedies. Their physicians prescribed exotic ingredients shipped from colonies, Indian hemp, Peruvian bark, even distilled bromides that sparkled like jewels when poured into crystal glasses. You picture yourself reclining against embroidered pillows, while a footman offers a silver tray of powders, each labelled with elegant script. "To settle your thoughts, madam," the doctor intones. And you can't help noticing how the cure sounds more like a ritual of status than science quirky tidbit. One aristocratic fad was sleeping draughts laced with opium, but flavored with rosewater, so the medicine seemed almost romantic. Imagine sipping what tastes like a floral cordial, only to find yourself drifting into oblivion. Another oddity, wealthy patients were sometimes advised to import pillows stuffed with the down of exotic birds, claiming the softness of foreign feathers carried mystical properties. Historians still argue whether these luxuries were genuine medical advice or merely elaborate ways to spend money under the guise of health. You glance around the chamber, noticing the sheer performance of sleeplessness. A maid adjusts the drapes to block out moonlight. Another sprinkles lavender water onto linens. The physician, meanwhile, insists the patient avoid novels at bedtime, warning that sensational literature overstimulates the imagination. You suppress a laugh, as if reading Wuthering Heights is the real threat, when the room already reeks of laudanum. The aristocrat sighs dramatically, as though auditioning for the role of tragic sufferer. You can't help but think that sleeplessness in this world doubled as theatre. Letters written by the wealthy often described insomnia with poetic flair. "My mind flutters like restless wings. The night hours gnaw my soul." Compare that to the blunt accounts of working men. "Can't sleep, back hurts, too much noise." Two very different languages, same problem. Historians still argue whether elite Victorians truly experienced worse insomnia or whether they simply talked about it more. After all, when you have leisure to describe every tossing and turning in your diary, the condition acquires grandeur. For the poor, words were wasted. They had to be awake before dawn regardless. A butler enters now with a decanter of port wine infused with valerian root. The physician nods approvingly. Valerian was one of the era's most common nerve tonics. You sip it and the bitter herb fights with the sweetness of wine. Is it effective? Maybe. But you notice something. The act of being served, of being tended to, seems as much a cure as the draught itself. It's not just medicine. It's attention, comfort, ritual. A little humor sneaks in as you picture this aristocrat dictating a list of forbidden foods at bedtime. No cheese, no pastry, no oysters, Cheese in particular, they warned, caused nightmares. You imagine yourself at supper, reluctantly pushing away a wedge of Stilton, muttering, "Better not. Or I'll dream of dancing skeletons again." Somehow, even in velvet chambers, the battle with sleeplessness retained a streak of absurdity. The longer you linger, the more you notice how these chambers blurred luxury and vulnerability. Heavy drapes kept out drafts, but also stifled fresh air. Feathers promised comfort, but aggravated allergies. Exotic syrups offered relief, but courted addiction. The cures themselves became a kind of insomnia, an endless cycle of purchases, rituals, and whispered prescriptions, each meant to fix the failure of the last. As you step back through the curtains, you glance at the aristocrat reclining theatrically, servants fussing, physicians scribbling notes. You realize the scene isn't so different from a modern spa retreat, sleep packaged as a luxury experience, complete with scented oils and imported bedding. The names have changed, but the promise remains the same. Rest can be bought, if only you spend enough, and so you leave the velvet chamber behind, amused and a little skeptical, stepping once more into the foggy London night. Somewhere out there, clerks and labourers are stumbling home from shifts, ready to crash onto straw mattresses without a drop of rosewater. Yet here in the upper echelons, sleeplessness is cultivated like an art form. Both groups chase the same elusive prize, but their paths couldn't look more different. The velvet curtains fall behind you, and the sound of clinking glasses fades into silence. You turn a corner and step into the grime of London's East End, where insomnia takes a very different shape. Here there are no velvet drapes, no rosewater drafts, only soot-stained bricks, flickering gas lamps, and men trudging home with their shirts stiff from coal dust. You join them, boots echoing on cobblestones, as the air smells of sweat, smoke, and cheap gin. The mainstream fact hits you quickly. The Industrial Revolution created longer working hours than many had ever known. Clerks hunched over ledgers by gaslight. Seamstresses bent at their machines till fingers bled, and coal miners stumbled into the night air only to wake before dawn. For these workers, insomnia wasn't a fashionable ailment. It was a brutal side effect of endless labour and noisy lodgings. Quirky tidbit: some workers tried to outsmart sleeplessness by clutching raw potatoes under their pillows. Yes, potatoes. Folklore claimed the earthy weight drew out restless energies. You grin at the image of a weary coalman hugging a spud like a teddy bear, muttering better than nothing. Historians still argue whether this folky cure came from genuine belief or from the fact that potatoes were one of the few cheap comforts available in crowded tenements. You follow a seamstress into her lodging house, a rickety building stuffed with families. The walls are so thin you can hear neighbours cough, argue, even snore in unison. Try falling asleep here. She lights a candle stub and produces a tin of cheap valerian powder, scooped with the handle of a spoon. One sniff is enough to make you wince. Valerian smells faintly of old socks, but it was the poor man's sedative. She mixes it into lukewarm beer, downs it, and lies back on a straw mattress. Whether it works or not, the ritual gives her hope. Historians still argue whether insomnia was more common among the poor or simply more devastating. Wealthy insomniacs could at least nap the next morning. The working class had no such luxury. A sleepless night meant fumbling through the day's labor with heavy eyes, risking mistakes, injuries, even dismissal. To them, sleep wasn't a philosophical concern. It was survival. You duck into a public house thick with pipe smoke and the low murmur of exhausted voices. The bartender slides you a glass of porter. Alcohol was the most common cure for the working class. 1 pint dulled the nerves, 2 pints blurred the edges of thought, 3 pints knocked you flat, if the noise of the pub didn't keep you awake first. Some historians suggest Britain's love affair with beer was partly tied to its role as a nighttime sedative. After all, water was often unsafe, but beer promised both hydration and oblivion. Still, alcohol was a double-edged sword. You feel the heaviness in your limbs, but notice your mind buzzing even more. Sleep will come quickly, perhaps, but it will be shallow, broken. Tomorrow's headache will be crueler than tonight's wakefulness. And yet, what choice does a weary clerk have when laudanum is too expensive and brass beds are out of reach? There's humor here, too. Imagine an exhausted factory worker telling his mate, "I tried valerian last night, smelled like rotten shoes but worked a treat." The friend replies, "Forget valerian, just knock yourself on the head with your boot." Crude, yes, But laughter was its own form of medicine in these quarters. You leave the pub and wander through the cramped alleys, where children still chase each other despite the hour. Sleep is a rare luxury in houses packed shoulder to shoulder. Some families even rented beds by the hour, with strangers rotating in and out. Imagine lying down only to be nudged awake because your time was up. If insomnia didn't find you naturally, such arrangements guaranteed it. A woman sits on a stoop rocking her baby, humming softly. The infant finally dozes, soothed less by song than by sheer exhaustion. The mother rubs her eyes, knowing her shift begins in just a few hours. Here, sleeplessness isn't a quirky nuisance, it's a thief, stealing health and strength from those who can least afford the loss. As you move on, you realize this. Insomnia is democratic in one sense, it strikes rich and poor alike, but the remedies, the rituals and the consequences are wildly unequal. Velvet-draped chambers offered silver trays of exotic powders. Coal-stained tenements offered potatoes and porter. Both groups stared at ceilings wide-eyed, but the stakes could not be more different. You step back into the night air, the fog thick and cold. Somewhere in the distance, a factory whistle shrieks, summoning the next shift. The poor worker yawns, rubs his gritty eyes, and trudges on. Insomnia follows him like a shadow, one that no velvet curtain or brass bed frame will ever chase away. The coal smoke drifts behind you, and the muffled din of factories fades until a new sound takes its place. The quiet, rhythmic swing of a pocket watch. You step into a narrow parlor, the kind converted from a townhouse front room, where the wallpaper curls at the edges and the lamps burn low. A man in a long coat greets you with a half smile, his voice soft, his gestures deliberate. Welcome to the rise of Victorian hypnotism parlors, where sleeplessness became a stage act of sorts, performed one swaying watch at a time. The mainstream fact is this: mesmerism, later called hypnotism, was a genuine craze in the mid-19th century. Doctors, showmen, and self-styled professors promised they could lull insomniacs into slumber, with little more than a calm voice and a pendulum swing. You take a seat, stiff-backed, as the mesmerist assures you that your eyelids are growing heavier by the moment. If you weren't tired before, the monotone repetition alone might do the trick. A quirky tidbit comes next. Some practitioners insisted on waving not just watches, but shiny dinner knives or even glowing crystals before the eyes. They believed the magnetism of the object itself transmitted healing power. You imagine yourself trying not to laugh while a man solemnly waves a kitchen utensil in your face, whispering, "Sleep will come, my friend." Historians still argue whether patients truly entered hypnotic states or whether they simply played along out of politeness or perhaps from sheer exhaustion. You glance around the parlor. A faint smell of incense curls in the air, meant to relax the senses. On the table sits a ledger filled with testimonials. After one session, "I slept 9 hours. I dreamed only of roses and awoke refreshed." The handwriting ranges from elegant to scrawled, but all insist the cure is real. You suspect the ritual, the quiet voice, the dim light, the rhythmic swing, was soothing in itself, regardless of any mystical magnetism. Of course, not everyone approved. Clergy denounced mesmerism as a form of sorcery, warning that opening one's mind to suggestion also opened it to sin. Doctors, too, squabbled about legitimacy. Some argued hypnotism was genuine science, a way to study the brain. Others dismissed it as little more than theater. Historians still argue whether the truth lies closer to medicine or performance art. Your eyes follow the swinging watch. It ticks faintly, a heartbeat in miniature. You feel your breathing slow, your muscles unclench. Perhaps this is how it worked. By coaxing the body into relaxation, the mind followed. Or perhaps you're simply bored, lulled by repetition the way a train's rhythm might rock a passenger to sleep. Either way, you sense why the Victorians paid to experience this curious ritual. Humor surfaces as you picture couples leaving the parlor, one declaring, "I slept like a baby," the other muttering, "He just waved a spoon at me and charged a shilling." Even then, the divide between true believers and skeptics was sharp. Yet the practice endured, spreading from drawing rooms to hospitals, where some physicians tentatively explored hypnotism as anesthesia for surgery. And, of course, as an insomnia cure, the mesmerist now turns to a new client, a pale clerk with ink-stained cuffs. The man slumps quickly, lulled into a half-trance, and the mesmerist whispers that he will sleep peacefully tonight, You notice the clerk's shoulders soften, as if an invisible burden has slipped free. Perhaps the cure is not in the method, but in the promise, the reassurance that someone, at last, is paying attention to his sleeplessness. As you step back into the foggy night, you can't help smiling at the memory of that swaying watch. Maybe it's silly, maybe it's profound. But in an age obsessed with pills, powders, and potions, hypnotism offered something different. The idea that sleep might be coaxed not with chemicals, but with suggestion, rhythm, and trust. And perhaps that's why the fad endured, not because it always worked, but because it gave insomniacs hope that their restless nights could be soothed by nothing more than a gentle voice in a quiet room. The fog outside the hypnotism parlor curls around you like a shawl, but instead of returning to the bustle of taverns and tenements, you drift toward the solemn silhouette of a church. Its heavy wooden doors stand ajar, a soft glow spilling out, and you slip inside. The air is cooler here, carrying the faint scent of wax and old wood. Candles flicker in iron sconces, their light playing across rows of pews. Tonight you find yourself in a place where insomnia is treated not with pills or potions, but with prayer and psalms whispered in the midnight hush. The mainstream fact is that many Victorians leaned heavily on religion for guidance in matters of health, and sleeplessness was no exception. Clergymen often preached that restless nights were the product of a troubled soul or a guilty conscience. If you could not sleep, perhaps it was because your thoughts had wandered from God. The solution: return to Scripture, recite the Psalms, sing hymns softly, let the rhythm of sacred words lull you toward rest. A quirky tidbit emerges from parish records. Some churches actually held late-night vigils, where attendees were encouraged to rest in the Word until slumber took them. Picture yourself curled uncomfortably on a pew, listening to a droning sermon about patience and nodding off, not from divine revelation but from sheer monotony. In that sense, the priest's sermon doubled. As both spiritual lesson and unintentional sleep, aid historians still argue whether Victorians genuinely believed insomnia was a moral failing, or whether this was simply a convenient explanation when medical cures failed. Was sleeplessness truly seen as a symptom of sin, or did the clergy seize on it as an opportunity to remind their congregations of nightly devotion? The debate lingers, much like the echo of hymns beneath these vaulted ceilings. You wander between the pews and notice pamphlets stacked neatly, their titles reading Nightly Meditations for the Wakeful or A Psalm for Every Hour of the Night. Imagine clutching such a booklet at 2 a.m., whispering verse after verse, not sure whether you're praying for forgiveness or simply counting lines the way you might count sheep. Either way, the rhythm offers something steady, and steadiness can be its own sedative. A minister approaches, smiling kindly. He suggests you try Psalm 4. I will lie down and sleep in peace. His voice is low, soothing, almost ASMR in cadence. For a moment you forget you're in the 19th century. It feels timeless, the universal comfort of someone repeating words meant to ease the restless mind. Whether or not divinity is present, the human gentleness certainly is. Of course, not everyone found solace in sermons. Some Victorians grumbled that listening to Scripture only sharpened their anxiety, filling their minds with moral questions rather than quiet. Others confessed to using church as an excuse for midnight gatherings, whispering gossip in the back pews while the preacher spoke. You chuckle at the image, a pair of insomniacs sneaking into a vigil, not to cure their sleeplessness, but to exchange rumors about Mrs. So-and-so's new bonnet. Humor surfaces again when you consider how many Victorians literally fell asleep in church. Accounts describe entire pews nodding off during particularly long-winded sermons. You imagine the preacher sighing in frustration, unaware he had just provided the cheapest insomnia cure in London. The flicker of candlelight grows softer as you linger. You kneel at a pew, rest your elbows on the rail, and feel the hush of the church wrap around you. Whether or not the words work, the act of pausing, of slowing your breath, offers its own gift. And perhaps that was the true function of midnight prayer, not necessarily to heal the soul, but to carve out a pocket of stillness in an age that rarely allowed it. You rise quietly and slip back into the night. The church doors close behind you, muffling the last hymn, but the cadence lingers in your mind. Scripture, like hypnotism, like laudanum, like warm milk, is another entry in the endless catalogue of Victorian insomnia cures. Some offered chemical force, others gentle rhythm. All in their own way promise the same thing: a quiet mind, a chance to rest, a reprieve from the relentless ticking of the clock. You leave the hushed church behind, the echo of psalms still murmuring in your ears, and wander back into the lamplit streets. This time the glow doesn't lead you to a pulpit or a parlor, but to a cramped bookstall tucked beneath a railway arch. Its shelves sag with cheap paper, and the vendor waves you closer. Tonight's cure for sleeplessness comes not from syrups or psalms, but from the printed word, the penny dreadful, the serialized novel, the bedside story that might either lull you into dreams or keep you wired till dawn. The mainstream fact is that literacy surged in Victorian Britain, and with it came a tidal wave of cheap literature. Newspapers, serialized novels, and penny dreadfuls flooded the market, selling for a penny apiece, and devoured by both clerks and aristocrats. Doctors often recommended light reading as a balm for restless minds, warning against stimulating conversation or vigorous thought before bed. The logic was simple: let the words carry you into gentle distraction until sleep arrived. Yet here's the quirky tidbit: many penny dreadfuls were anything but gentle. They brimmed with highwaymen, gory murders, ghosts, and melodrama. Imagine lying in bed, candle guttering low, reading about Sweeney Todd sharpening his razor, and expecting to drift off peacefully. It's almost comical. Historians still argue whether these tales were genuinely meant to soothe insomniacs, or whether they simply provided a distraction until exhaustion overcame them. Did they calm the mind or excite it beyond repair? You take one pamphlet in hand. The paper is thin, the ink already smudging your fingers. The title promises The Terrifying Midnight Adventures of Varney the Vampire. You picture yourself reading it beneath the covers, every creak in the house suddenly amplified, sleep driven further away. And yet there's comfort in the ritual, the flicker of the candle, the slow turning of pages, the sense that you're not alone in your sleeplessness but accompanied by a story. Some readers preferred gentler fare, travel accounts, moral tales, or even gardening manuals. Yes, there are accounts of Victorians reading seed catalogues before bed, convinced that the monotony of plant varieties would coax them towards slumber. You chuckle at the idea of nodding off mid-sentence. Turnip early white grows in 7 weeks. If sheep counting failed, vegetable counting might suffice. Historians still debate whether the explosion of cheap print worsened insomnia by overstimulating minds or helped it by offering inexpensive distraction. Some argue that candlelight reading strained eyes and delayed sleep, others that the comfort of routine outweighed any harm. The truth, as always, likely lies in the middle. Some readers slept, some stayed up till sunrise muttering, "Just one more chapter." You picture a clerk slumped over his penny dreadful, snoring gently with the pamphlet still clutched in hand. Meanwhile, a nervous young woman sets aside her novel of ghostly apparitions and blows out the candle, heart still racing. Reading, like laudanum or hypnotism, was no universal cure. It was an experiment in self-distraction. Humor sneaks in when you imagine Victorian parents scolding children, "Don't read dreadfuls in bed, you'll never sleep." The same warning modern parents give about scrolling on phones under the covers. Some habits and some anxieties really never change. You run your fingers across the worn spines of novels stacked high. Dickens, Collins, Gaskell, authors whose serialized works kept readers awake with anticipation week after week. Entire households awaited the next installment, sometimes reading aloud together by lamplight. It was communal sleeplessness, a society united in cliffhangers. If you couldn't sleep, at least you had company in your wakefulness. Finally, you tuck a slim pamphlet under your arm, more for the ritual than the content. Reading in bed is less about what you read than about the act itself. The slow turning of pages, the faint smell of ink, the sense of slipping into another world. Whether it ends in sleep or in wide-eyed suspense, the ritual matters. And so you wander from the railway arch with your penny dreadful in hand, the night stretching ahead. Somewhere 1,000 other Victorians are propped on pillows, candles flickering low, eyes squinting over lurid tales. Some will fall asleep mid-sentence, others will lie awake haunted by fictional villains. But all will share in the strange comfort of words as a companion against the restless dark. The railway arch fades behind you, and now the night hum swells with a new rhythm, iron wheels clattering, whistles shrieking, steam sighing into the air. You find yourself on a Victorian platform, lanterns swinging in the fog, as passengers shuffle aboard carriages bound for distant towns. Tonight you enter another chapter in the saga of sleeplessness, railway travel, and the strange contraptions Victorians devised to capture slumber aboard the noisy beast of modern progress. The mainstream fact is this: the advent of long-distance rail travel in the 19th century revolutionized not just movement, but also sleeping habits. For the first time, ordinary travelers could spend whole nights in motion, rattling along steel tracks toward morning destinations. Companies soon introduced sleeper cars, promising passengers the luxury of rest on the rails. You climb aboard one now, and instantly feel the contradiction. The compartment boasts plush upholstery, velvet curtains, and faint gaslight, but the floor vibrates, the walls groan, and every jolt threatens to fling you sideways. Quirky tidbit? Some railway companies experimented with mechanical sleep headrests, contraptions strapped to a passenger's chin or forehead to keep their head upright while dozing. Imagine nodding off only to be jolted awake by a leather strap digging into your jaw. Others sold portable hammocks meant to be hooked inside compartments. You chuckle at the thought of passengers swaying wildly with every turn, looking more like laundry flapping on a line than restful sleepers. Historians still argue whether these devices were genuine innovations or clever gimmicks designed to soothe anxious customers. The compartment fills with characters. A stout gentleman snores thunderously, his top hat balanced precariously on his stomach. A lady fusses with smelling salts, convinced the stale air will suffocate her. You take a seat by the window, watching the countryside flash by in ghostly silhouettes. The rhythm of the train is hypnotic. Chug, chug, clatter, clatter. For a moment you think it might work. Your eyes drift shut, and then whistle! A blast loud enough to rattle your teeth. So much for that. Historians still argue whether Victorian sleeper cars actually improved travel rest or simply provided a new stage for insomnia. Reports from the period describe passengers lying awake, listening to the cacophony of snoring strangers, coughing children, and clattering wheels. Yet for some, the novelty itself was enough to induce sleep. The sheer exhaustion of modern travel, working like a crude sedative. One humorous account from a diary describes a man waking in a sleeper car to find his neighbor's wig resting on his shoulder, like a small animal. Another mentions passengers rolling onto each other as the train jolted, sparking awkward apologies and occasional arguments. Sleep, if it came, was communal, messy, and never quite private. Still, railway companies marketed their sleeper cars as marvels of comfort. Advertisements showed elegant passengers reclining gracefully, as though the train's roar were a mere lullaby. You imagine the marketing department, carefully omitting the reality of coal soot, drifting through cracks and engines, screeching at every stop. You lean your head against the window, the glass cool beneath your temple. Outside, moonlight gleams on fields and hedgerows. Inside, the compartment sways, curtains shiver, and your fellow passengers groan in their semi-slumber. There's something strangely soothing about the chaos. Maybe sleep on a train was never meant to be perfect. Maybe it was about surrendering to motion, letting the world carry you forward whether you rested or not. By the time the train slows at a junction, dawn's first light is edging the horizon. You stretch stiffly, realizing you never truly slept, only hovered in a haze between waking and dreaming. And yet, isn't that half the story of insomnia? You may not conquer it, but you learn to live in its liminal space, finding fragments of rest where you can. You step down from the carriage onto a platform still slick with dew. Behind you, passengers stumble, yawn, and grumble, all sharing the same bleary-eyed expression. Sleeplessness has ridden the rails with them through the night, and will ride with them again tomorrow. The train may promise arrival, but rest remains an elusive destination. The dawn-lit platform drifts away, and soon you find yourself walking along gravel paths edged with dew. The roar of trains is gone, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves and the faint cry of seabirds. Ahead lies a tall brick building with whitewashed windows, its gates opening into manicured lawns and winding garden walks. You have arrived at one of the Victorian sanatoriums, half hospital, half retreat, where sleepless souls came seeking air, quiet, and moonlit strolls as medicine. The mainstream fact is this: by the mid-19th century, a growing number of asylums, convalescent homes, and seaside sanatoriums began advertising themselves as cures for nervous disorders, including chronic insomnia. Doctors insisted that fresh air, Structured routines and time in gardens could soothe overwrought minds. You step inside and immediately notice the schedule pinned to the wall. Walks at dawn, cold baths at noon, supervised naps after supper. It's less about spontaneity and more about discipline, a belief that order itself could restore rest. A quirky tidbit: some of these institutions arranged moonlight promenades, encouraging patients to walk in silence under the stars before bed. They claimed the moon's calm light would regulate nerves. You picture yourself strolling slowly in a line of insomniacs, all wrapped in shawls, shuffling like pilgrims toward sleep. Historians still argue whether such promenades genuinely helped or were simply distractions, a way to pass the night with dignity rather than pacing. Restlessly indoors, you wander through the sanatorium's gardens. Lavender hedges border gravel walks. Benches sit strategically under chestnut trees. The air smells faintly of salt, carried from the nearby sea. A physician in a bowler hat insists that ozone from ocean breezes purifies the lungs and steadies the heart. You chuckle softly, knowing ozone isn't quite what they thought, but also admitting the sea air does feel bracing. Perhaps part of the cure was simply getting people out of smoky cities. Inside the wards, you glimpse tidy rows of beds with white coverlets. Windows are thrown wide, even in winter, because physicians believed ventilation itself was medicinal. The patients lie quietly, some staring at ceilings, others pretending to sleep. Nurses patrol softly, tucking blankets, offering cups of barley water, adjusting pillows. You sense how much of the cure relied on atmosphere, serenity imposed by routine, silence enforced by watchful staff. Historians still argue whether these retreats represented genuine progress in mental health or whether they were little more than genteel prisons. On one hand, patients were spared the chaos of London. On the other, they lost freedom, bound to strict schedules. Yet for many insomniacs, the very act of being told, "Here is where you rest, here is how you rest," may have been enough to quiet frantic minds. There's humor in imagining some patients sneaking out of bed, whispering jokes on the moonlit walks, or smuggling penny dreadfuls beneath their coverlets. After all, insomnia doesn't vanish just because the schedule says lights out. Even in sanctuaries of calm, restlessness lurked. You smile at the thought of a nurse discovering contraband novels and scolding patients with a stern, "That's not conducive to slumber, sir." In the sanatorium's library, you find rows of appropriate books, moral tales, botanical guides, devotional works. No Sweeney Todd, no lurid murders. Reading material was carefully chosen to soothe, not excite. You settle into a chair, flipping through a gardening manual, and feel your own eyes grow heavy. Perhaps they were onto something after all. Evening falls. Patients gather on verandas, wrapped in shawls, sipping warm milk. The sea glimmers silver under the moon. A hush spreads through the grounds, punctuated only by the crunch of gravel paths and the sigh of waves. It's easy to imagine this ritual calming a restless mind, not because the moonlight holds magic, but because repetition builds its own spell. As you step out of the sanatorium gates, you glance back once more. The building glows softly, lanterns flickering in tidy rows of windows. Inside, some patients will sleep, others will lie awake, but all will at least share the comfort of structure, air, and the illusion of healing. And maybe illusion in the weary battle with insomnia is half the cure. The sea breeze fades behind you and the gravel path gives way once again to cobbled London streets. Yet this time the air is not thick with coal smoke or incense. It's sharp with perfume, starch, and the faint rustle of silk skirts. You follow the sound of carriage wheels until you arrive at a townhouse where lamps burn late. Inside, a lady in her 30s reclines on a chaise, eyes ringed with fatigue, while a physician jots notes. Tonight's theme, hysterical sleeplessness, the diagnosis so often pinned on women, and the bizarre rituals prescribed to tame it. The mainstream fact is sobering. Victorian medicine linked women's insomnia to hysteria, a supposed disorder of the female nervous system tied to reproductive organs. Doctors argued that sleeplessness in women was not a condition of overwork or stress, but of temperament and biology. You can almost hear the physician mutter, "Her womb is restless. Naturally, so is she." You roll your eyes and perhaps stifle a laugh because the logic is as flawed as it is revealing. The quirky tidbit? Prescriptions could be downright absurd. Some physicians advised women to sleep on specially designed rocking beds, gently swayed by servants, until drowsiness overcame them, like cradling an adult infant. Others suggested ice caps placed on the head to cool overheated thoughts. You picture a fashionable lady lying back with a frosty helmet strapped on, wondering why she's not dreaming of snowfields by now. Historians still argue whether these rituals were taken seriously by patients or merely endured with polite compliance, while true rest remained elusive. The scene around you is thick with contradictions. The lady on the chaise has tried valerian drops, warm baths, even prayers at midnight, but nothing seems to quiet her mind. The physician recommends avoiding novels, again, and insists she limit stimulating conversation, especially with male visitors. As if insomnia might be cured by boredom alone, you glance at her vanity table. Alongside powders and perfumes sit bottles of bromide salts and jars of camphor ointment. These were marketed as ladies' nerve remedies, designed to soothe sleeplessness without the scandal of opium. In practice, they often caused indigestion or dizziness. Still, the packaging was pastel. The labels polite, the implication clear. A respectable woman could treat her nerves without whispering about laudanum in mixed company. Historians still argue whether women truly experienced more insomnia than men, or whether doctors simply recorded it more eagerly. Diaries from the period suggest women did indeed suffer restless nights, but so did men. The difference lay in interpretation. Men were overworked, women were hysterical. Same sleeplessness, different diagnosis. There's humor in imagining the rocking bed, a lady swaying gently like a ship passenger, servants yawning as they push the contraption back and forth, whispering to each other, "She's still awake, what now?" Or the ice cap sliding off mid-slumber, thudding onto the carpet. Sometimes the cure was more disruptive than the illness, but beneath the comedy lingers something heavier. For women, sleeplessness was rarely treated as a neutral condition. It became a stage for social control, a way of labeling female anxiety or frustration as pathology. If you couldn't sleep, it wasn't because your life was stressful. It was because your femininity was faulty. The diagnosis itself became another burden, another reason to toss and turn at night. You watch as the physician rises, satisfied with his notes. He prescribes more rest, less reading, and a week at a seaside sanatorium. The lady nods politely, though her eyes betray skepticism. She knows the problem won't be solved by sea air or pastel powders, but in an age when women's voices carried little authority in medical debates, she accepts the ritual of treatment, if only to avoid being labeled uncooperative. As you step back into the night, you can't shake the feeling that gender shaped insomnia as much as physiology. Men's sleeplessness was framed as consequence of ambition, women's as evidence of weakness. Both tossed and turned under the same moon, but their stories were told and treated so differently. The fog closes in, and you carry the image of that ice cap and rocking bed with you, absurd and tragic all at once, symbols of how Victorians tried to cradle women's sleeplessness into silence. The townhouse with its rocking bed and ice caps fades into the mist, and you walk onward until you hear a faint hum. No, not of hymns or trains, but of something stranger. Sparks crackle in the darkness, accompanied by the faint metallic whine of machinery. You step into a laboratory, cluttered with coils of wire, glass jars, and brass instruments, where a physician-turned-inventor eagerly waves you closer. Tonight you witness the Victorian fascination with science, sparks, and the earliest sleep experiments. The mainstream fact is striking. By the late 19th century, doctors began treating insomnia with experimental devices that used electricity, magnetism, and even primitive light therapy. Electricity was hailed as the force of the future, a kind of invisible elixir that might regulate nerves and induce rest. You sit cautiously on a chair while wires are clipped to your wrists, the inventor assuring you the current is as gentle as a whisper. Your hair prickles instantly. Not exactly reassuring, a quirky tidbit shines through. Some inventors designed electric pillows filled with coiled wires, promising to lull the brain into slumber with soft shocks. Imagine lying down, head buzzing faintly, and telling yourself, "This is fine, this is science." Others built magnetic nightcaps stitched with iron filings, claiming they aligned the brain with the Earth's fields. You chuckle at the image of insomniacs marching to bed like armored knights, helmets buzzing faintly as they tried to dream. Historians still argue whether these experiments were pioneering neuroscience or just Victorian gadget mania. dressed up in lab coats. The laboratory hums around you. Jars glow faintly with phosphorescent chemicals. Coils spark with bluish arcs. A patient sits stiffly under a glass dome meant to regulate breathing rhythms, while another swears the rhythmic flashing of light bulbs has finally coaxed him into slumber. You can't help but think it resembles a carnival of science more than a clinic. Historians still argue whether these devices actually worked by altering nervous activity or simply by exhausting the imagination. After all, how could you not feel sleepy after spending an hour strapped into a buzzing contraption, bored and bewildered? Perhaps the gadget was less a cure and more a placebo with extra sparks. Humor bubbles up as you imagine spouses reacting to these devices. One gentleman straps on his magnetic nightcap, only for his wife to mutter, "If that thing hums all night, I'm moving to the sofa." Or a lady adjusting her electric pillow and suddenly yelping, "It tickles!" The bedroom must have resembled more of a workshop than a sanctuary, but the seriousness of the effort cannot be dismissed. These experiments reflected genuine attempts to merge modern science with age-old struggles. For centuries, sleeplessness was blamed on demons or weak constitutions. Now it was approached with electrodes, wires, and hypotheses. In a sense, Victorian science reframed insomnia as something measurable, physical, subject to experiment, rather than prayer or superstition. That shift, however clumsy, paved the way for the sleep science we take for granted today. You wander deeper into the lab, past shelves stacked with notebooks. Sketches depict dream cycles, diagrams of brain currents, wild theories about nerve energy. Some notes insist insomnia is caused by overstimulation of thought, others by underuse of muscles, still others by magnetic imbalance. The truth remains elusive, but the sheer determination impresses you. Insomnia had become not just a private frustration, but a problem to be solved by invention. As the inventor powers down his devices, the room falls silent. You notice your heart still thudding, your hair still charged. Did the experiment relax you or simply tire you out from nerves? Hard to say. But as you step back into the cool night air, you can't deny the strangeness of it all. The Victorians turned sleeplessness into an arena for science fiction come alive. Pillows that sparked, helmets that magnetized, lamps that pulsed like artificial moons. And though most of these contraptions vanished into obscurity, the legacy lingers. Modern sleep studies with their electrodes and brain scans echo the same impulse, to measure the unmeasurable, to tame the night with machines. You walk on amused and oddly grateful, carrying with you the memory of humming coils and glowing jars, symbols of an age where insomnia met its most peculiar foe, electricity itself. The laboratory sparks fade behind you, leaving only the faint smell of ozone clinging to your coat. The night is quieter now, the fog thinner, and as you walk you sense that the frenzy of Victorian cures is nearing its end. Ahead lies a newspaper stall, papers rustling in the breeze. Headlines shout of modern nerve science and new theories of rest. You've reached the close of the century. When the craze for insomnia cures began to wane, replaced by new ideas, new doubts, and the creeping sense that perhaps all those potions and contraptions were never the answer after all. The mainstream fact is clear. By the late 1800s, medicine was shifting toward neurology and psychiatry. Insomnia was no longer seen simply as weak digestion or wandering wombs. It was reframed as a disorder of the nervous system, part of a broader study of mental health. Doctors began writing more cautiously about laudanum and chloral, warning of dependency. Advertisements for patent pills were scrutinized, their sugar coatings no longer sweet enough to disguise the risks. The age of miracle syrups and quack contraptions was drawing to a close, a quirky tidbit. One of the last oddities of the era was the invention of sleeping hats lined with herbs like hops and chamomile, worn like nightcaps that promised to waft gentle sedative fumes all night. You chuckle at the thought, ending the century in bed with a perfumed bonnet, hoping dreams smell floral. Historians still argue whether these final fads were harmless comforts or just desperate holdovers before science fully claimed the field. You pause at the stall and scan the pamphlets. Some declare that sleeplessness is the curse of modern civilization, unavoidable in the age of machines. Others insist that regular habits, quiet evenings, early bedtimes, less coffee, are the only real cures. It feels familiar, doesn't it? The same debates echo in today's wellness blogs. Lavender sprays, blue light warnings, digital detoxes, new packaging, old anxieties. As you walk further, you think back on all the cures you've witnessed tonight. The pink sugar pills, the feather beds, the laudanum drafts, the seamstress clutching a potato, the aristocrat swaying in her rocking bed, the mesmerist waving his watch, the sanatorium patients promenading in the moonlight. Each cure promised peace. Few delivered, yet in each you glimpsed the same yearning, the universal desire for rest, for silence, for escape from the tyranny of the clock. Historians still argue whether Victorians truly suffered more insomnia than people before or after them, or whether they simply had the language, the commerce, and the cultural appetite to make sleeplessness into a spectacle. Perhaps the condition was always there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right century to be named, bottled, and sold. There's humor in the sheer variety of it all. Imagine a collector trying to catalogue every Victorian sleep cure: potatoes, pillows, prayers, powders, pulsing electrodes. The list would look more like a magician's prop trunk than a medical guide. And yet perhaps that chaos is part of the charm. It shows just how inventive, how desperate, how human people become when faced with the quiet terror of lying awake. The city is still now. The lamps glow faintly. The carriages are gone and the Thames whispers against its banks. You stop on a bridge and rest your elbows on the stone. Somewhere in those darkened houses, a man snores in a brass bed, a woman lies awake beneath her herbal nightcap, and a child dreams peacefully after a sip of honeyed milk. The cures differ, the struggles remain the same, and as the century closes, you feel a strange calm. The Victorians may have left behind their syrups and gadgets, but they left something else too. The reminder that sleeplessness is not shameful, not solitary, but part of a long, shared story. You belong to a lineage of midnight wanderers, always searching, always hoping, always ready to try one more cure. The night grows softer now. Your footsteps slow, and so the story of Victorian insomnia cures fades with the fog, leaving only the steady rhythm of your breath, and the promise, maybe, just maybe, that sleep waits around the corner. And now as we close this long wander through Victorian nights, the pace slows. You no longer hurry through gaslit streets or jostle on rattling trains. The air is gentle, the lamps distant, the world softening at its edges. You feel the weight of velvet curtains and feather pillows, the faint perfume of lavender and rosewater, the hush of sanatorium gardens, all blending into one hazy memory. It doesn't matter anymore whether the cures worked or failed. What lingers is the sense that people tried earnestly, stubbornly, sometimes foolishly, but always with hope. You let that thought rest in your chest like a warm coal. Every culture, every age has faced sleeplessness. Every heart has known the long hours of watching shadows stretch across the ceiling. And every heart, too, has sought comfort, whether in prayer, in science, in laughter, or in a simple cup of warm milk. You are part of that same story, a thread in a fabric that spans centuries. There is nothing lonely about your wakefulness. Now let the images blur. The watch swinging gently, the feather bed sighing, the moonlight glimmering on quiet gardens. Each detail softens, fading like candlelight at the end of a vigil. You no longer need to follow footsteps or turn pages. The story has wound down, its edges unraveling into silence. Your breathing steadies, your shoulders sink. The night hums quietly around you, fan, wind, heartbeat. Nothing urgent remains, just this stillness wide and kind. So let your eyes drift, let your thoughts loosen, let the long Victorian night dissolve into your own gentle rest. Sleep is not something you chase. It comes when you stop searching, when you allow yourself to float. And now you float.